public beheadings, the so-called demonstration killings by ISIS, refused to condemn the Islamic State and its brutality, and accused Australia of being complicit in the deaths of millions of Muslims. Now, his name is Wussam Dorehe. He's the official spokesman for Hizb ut-Tahrir, a radical Muslim group, so-called hate preachers. The very group the Prime Minister suggested yesterday should be reviewed. In the studio with me, the Prime Minister, Mr Abbott. Good morning.
Morning, Neil.
Could I play you some of what happened on Lateline last night? This man and the reporter, he refused to condemn the beheadings and turned it back on this country and its allies.
Are you outraged by the image of an Australian-born child of 7 years old holding up severed heads like trophies in Iraq or Syria?
Let me tell you what I am outraged by.
So you won't even answer that question.
Are you going to allow me to answer the question? If you wanted a one-way discussion,
which you have obviously come here knowing you didn't want to answer. Does that justify beheading? Does that justify the slaughter of innocents?
Why don't you condemn what the Australian government is doing? Why don't you condemn what the American government is doing? Why don't you condemn the innocent killing of 1 million lives in Iraq and Afghanistan? Why don't you do that?
Tony Abbott, does this confirm your concerns about this organisation?
Well, yes, it does, Neil. This is an organisation which is very careful to avoid advocating terrorism, but is always making excuses for terrorist organisations. And I regard it as un-Australian, frankly. I do regard it as un-Australian to stand up there and make excuses for terrorism, to defend terrorism, to blame everyone but the terrorists for their actions. I think what the terrorists are doing in the Middle East is absolutely abhorrent. And as my friend Prime Minister Najib of Malaysia has said on a number of occasions, and he's a pious Muslim, he said what they're doing is against God, it's against Islam, it's against our common humanity, and out of human decency, out of ordinary human decency, this gentleman should have said it's wrong, it's just wrong.
Why won't they condemn it? Does it mean they support it?
Well, this is a very fair question. There was a fascinating, a long essay that the former British Prime Minister Tony Blair wrote a couple of weeks ago, and he published on the Blair Faith Foundation's website, so it would be readily available to people if they want to read it. And he made the point that there is the fringe, a small minority of people who engage in terrorism, and then there's the spectrum, a much larger group of people who support an ideology, who have a set of beliefs which justifies terrorism. Now, they're not practitioners of terrorism, but they have an ideology which justifies and explains terrorism. And the point that Tony Blair, the former British Prime Minister, is making is that while we must resist fiercely terrorists themselves, do everything we can to defeat the terrorists, we also have to intellectually wrestle and grapple with the spectrum of thinking which supports terrorism.
So you're saying Hizb ut-Tahrir?
Absolutely, absolutely. Hizb ut-Tahrir is an organisation with an ideology which justifies terrorism, and that's why I say it's un-Australian. It's also un-Islamic because no respectable Muslim should have these views.
So what do you do about them in Australia?
Well, look, we stand up and say it's wrong at every opportunity, and good on Emma Alberici. She's a feisty interviewer, and I'm sure I've come off second best on occasions with Emma Alberici and other late-line presenters, but good on her for having a go, and I think she spoke for our country last night.
Is there anything you can do further about this group, or is there anything you want to do further about this group?
As you know, Neil, we are changing the laws, subject, of course, to passage through the Parliament, but we want to change the laws, and we want to make an offence not just to engage in terrorist activity, but to engage in terrorist advocacy. Now, it will be a question of law, I suppose, whether Hizb ut-Tahrir are doing that.
Well, what they did last night...
Certainly it will be a lot easier to tackle organisations like Hizb ut-Tahrir in the future than it has been in the past.
Well, what was said last night, should that be prescribed under your legislation? Should it be prevented?
Well, certainly if poor old Andrew Bolt is prosecuted for a mild, relatively mild piece, I know it was a different law, it was Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act, but if we are looking for objectionable speech, the kind of stuff which we're hearing from Hizb ut-Tahrir is infinitely more objectionable than anything you'd ever hear from Andrew Bolt.
Well, would you like to see it taken further on what was said last night?
Well, the point I was making yesterday is that it's one thing for Australians born and bred to be saying things that are objectionable. It's another thing for preachers of hate to be coming in from overseas, and Hizb ut-Tahrir from time to time sponsor what I describe as preachers of hate coming in from overseas to speak to people in various settings here in Australia. And I love people coming to our country to learn from us, to enjoy our magnificent environment, to visit friends, family, do all that kind of thing. But what I don't want is people coming to this country to make trouble. And Hizb ut-Tahrir spokespeople and advocates coming to this country are just here to stir up trouble. And as far as I'm concerned, it's not going to happen. And I say to the preachers of hate, if you think you're coming to Australia to spread your pernicious message, your divisive ideology, think again, you won't get in.
But you have here a message from a local person, presumably an Australian citizen, I don't know. Yep. What can you do about that?
Well, I'm sitting here in your studio, Neil, saying to your listeners that this is objectionable, it's wrong, it's un-Islamic, it's un-Australian, and I hope he wakes up to himself.
What is your response to his suggestion that Australia is complicit in the deaths of millions of Muslims?
What we're doing right now is defending millions of Muslims from the murderous rage of ISIL. That's what we're doing. That's what we were hoping to do and largely succeeded in doing in Afghanistan between 2002 and very recently. That's what we are seeking to do now. That's what we were trying to do in Iraq previously. And the interesting thing about ISIL is that they have killed tens of thousands of people. They've killed Shia, they've killed Sunni, they've killed Turkmen, they've killed Yazidi, they've killed Kurds, they've killed Assyrians, they've killed other Christians. They're indiscriminate killers. They kill without compunction, and that's why I call them a death cult. Nothing to do with religion. The only God they worship is death.
96900 693 13 13 32. This issue is damaging the country. We've got kids who are cadets at school being told not to wear their uniforms in public, emergency services not wearing their uniforms in public, police in Victoria to be armed at all times. Is this all necessary and is it permanent?
Well, I'm the last person to say that organisations shouldn't give instructions to their members for their own good and for their own protection. But I would personally never advise someone not to wear our country's uniform. It's a personal choice, I suppose, whether you wear it on your way to school if you're a cadet or whether you wear it on the way to the station if you're a CFA member. It's a matter for the Commissioner whether police should be armed or not. But personally, I would never encourage anyone who is serving our community not to wear our uniform. It's a personal choice and an organisational matter, exactly what advice they get.
I'm a little unclear on the comments today whether it remains likely that the SAS could go into combat in Iraq. The language seems to have changed a little. Is there an increasing possibility of the SAS going into combat?
We've got two very specific missions, Neil. The first is to fly combat air patrols and strike missions over Iraq. We've also got an early warning and control aircraft, a Wedgetail over there. We've got a refueler over there. So the Wedgetail and the refueler are flying support missions for combat aircraft. Our Super Hornet strike fighters are there to fly combat air patrols. We've also got up to 200 special forces there, and they are not yet on the ground in Iraq. We're awaiting final legal documentation before that deployment happens. They'll be there on an advise and assist mission. They'll be working with the headquarters of Iraqi units Some of them may be deployed as kind of combat air controllers to call in airstrikes and so on. It's not our intention that they will engage in actual combat, and certainly there will be no independent combat operations by Australian forces.
The cost of all this, Labor Party, well, Joe Hockey says the Labor Party should support it. Do you agree, if it's bipartisan?
Well, to his great credit, Opposition Leader Bill Shorten has been very bipartisan on this. I've had numerous conversations with Bill about this, and he is an Australian patriot. He fully understands the threat that ISIL poses. He wants to see Australian forces deployed in a sensible way to protect our country and to protect the wider world, and I'm confident that we will continue to have strong bipartisanship from the opposition.
But should he be helping you with financial measures, i.e. your budget, to pay for it?
Well, Neil, look, I want our budget measures to be passed by the Parliament. I accept that the opposition is absolutely entitled to come to its own position on our budget measures. I think there are strong arguments in favour of all of our budget measures. If the Labor Party doesn't want to support our budget measures, I think they should come up with their own alternative savings. And my critique of the Labor Party is that having got us into the budgetary mess, they're now obstructing the measures to get us out of the budgetary mess.
But we are now in a different situation with these added costs of our involvement in Iraq. Has Labor got a responsibility now to pass what you want so they can pay the bills?
Let's keep the costs in perspective. We're talking here about perhaps $500 million a year, depending upon how much ordnance is used. In terms of the debt and deficit disaster that we inherited, this is a relatively small amount. Now, the challenge for Labor is to come up with a proper budget strategy, given that they're not, at this stage, prepared to accept our budget strategy.
We'll take a quick call. Lena, go ahead, please.
Here we go.
Good morning, Mr. Abbott. Good morning, Neil.
Lena.
I would just like to know, as a Muslim myself, with all these...
And that's where we leave it there. That's the Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, there speaking to Neil Mitchell on radio in Melbourne.